My name is Philip Garner. I'm the editor of Support for Learning, which is one of Nasen's journals. And what I want to do very briefly today is to talk about a potential future, but very much drawing on the history of the journal Support for Learning. And I want to do that to illustrate the crucial importance of practitioners to the health and well-being of research communities, not just in schools, but also in colleges, universities, and research establishments. I've been involved in education for almost 50 years, and that's not as a student or a school child. When I came through Coventry, my heart tugged because that was where I first took a teaching post, and that was in 1971. A wonderful place which really began my connection with youngsters of difference. 1986, so 15 years after that, was the inception of Support for Learning as a journal. And when I glanced last night at the content of Support for Learning, I was really quite struck with the amount of material in there which related directly to practice, or in fact was contributed to by practitioners. So what I want to do is to develop that theme a little bit as I go through. And the way in which I want to do it is by looking at the purpose of using research in school at ground level, its meaning, why in fact it's there in the first place, beyond simply being an opportunity for people to talk about their own work and to publicise it. And also particularly to look at the accessibility issue that has emerged in the last, I think, 10 years, where practitioners are now much more able to get their work noticed and therefore discussed and taken account of, and therefore influencing the practice, not just around them, but more generally too. As I say, I'm going to illustrate my conversation by a focus on themes, methodologies, and the recognition that practitioner-focused research is coming to have within the profession. Before I do that, however, just a brief word about the cruciality of practitioner researchers in the context of professional development. My view is that teachers, quite naturally, are inquirers. And the term research, I think, is rather problematic because it's loaded with all sorts of inferences about universities, research establishments, and publishing in high order, high-ranked journals for academics. I think the word inquiry is a much more user-friendly and appropriate word. After all, that's what effective teachers are. They're inquirers. They inquire about context, they inquire about circumstance, they inquire about intervention, and certainly they inquire about outcomes. At the tail end, I will point to some resources and also a link to where you can obtain these resources directly from myself. So I think that this whole issue is captured really well in this slide, talking about meaningful inquiry in inclusive classrooms. And if you follow the wheel round, you'll see that the first couple from 12 o'clock onwards, the first couple of lozenge-shaped symbols indicate our task of finding themes, what should be researched. After all, and I will suggest at the tail end of the session that I receive as an editor so many articles, proposed articles on particular topics, overloaded, often categorical topics to do with either Down syndrome, ASD, SEMH, and so forth. But I think that first part of this process, this research wheel, is crucial. And I want to say a few things about that. And then we move into the actual doing of the activity of inquiry. And that is very much about methodology, finding methodologies which are appropriate, sensitive, ethical, and connected with the real task of practice in our schools and classrooms and wider spaces. Continuing round after 9 o'clock, we have the task of recognition, of sharing our research with colleagues, with those who are the principal stakeholders in the work that we do, how to get it out there to be noticeable both within school settings and from my perspective, introducing more writers, practitioners to writing for the journal. So, themes. Themes, methodologies and recognition are all predicated by being personal, context dependent and achievable. The personalisation of themes comes very much from the almost intuitive sense of practitioners in the classroom, that they've spotted something that needs more digging, more uncovering, and more inquiry systematically. And that often generates ideas. For support for learning, for example, recently we had not just an idea, but almost a polemical piece written about reading schemes. A writer who felt very much that reading schemes were devices which narrowed the experience of children, and he wanted to explore that from a hugely personalised view. And I think that it's absolutely crucial that a journal like Support for Learning helps practitioners to do that. We all have hunches, we all have ideas, we all have fixations even, and I think we should be allowed to write about them, obviously in a respectful and considered way, but nevertheless being quite parochial almost. Many of the articles in recent issues of Support for Learning have been context-bound. For example, there was a lovely piece written earlier this year by two authors, Helena Bunn and Lauren Bosley. And they talked about this piece that they, or this intervention that they had, which was about the new school. The idea that transitions, as we all know, are one of the most important and yet sometimes traumatic experiences for children. And Helena and Lauren wrote very persuasively about that, but it was very much from the context of a resource and very much from the context of an individual place. Thirdly, being achievable, doing something that actually brings meaning to research. I find myself being as an ex-practitioner, as an ex-teacher, as an ex-head teacher even, I find myself really troubled by the notion that academics write for other academics. And there was, I think it's a mythical comment, really, from someone, and I would love to drill down and find exactly who said this, but apparently for the really high-ranking academic journals, often the readership for some articles is maybe 5 or 6. And then when you turn to the article, you see that the article has 5 or 6 co-authors, which raises all sorts of questions. My feeling is that that research, which is undertaken with a sharp focus upon practice, is the most effective and the most valuable because it's useful. For example, a writer in one of this year's editions of the journal wrote about a safe space for vulnerable children in a single school. I really have no problem at all at research that some might claim is not generalizable. Most non-generalizable research is actually very potent because it actually drills down to a problem that is visible in a school or setting. Methodologies. Proceeding with caution, taking account of the personal, the context dependency, and the achievability in our methodology. So we have to ask ourselves, does the methodology ask the right questions? Does it fit the theme that we've identified? A really excellent example of this, and it shows the divergence of evidence that we can use when we're writing as practitioners, was an article written in an issue last year which was made up of contributions from teachers from a single local authority in Greater London. And one writer was using her involvement in her NPQH certification alongside a range of other school-based documents as evidence, as data. It was absolutely personalised, but it was totally relevant to responding to the question about developing a pupil-centred assessment system. She was using her NPQH theme, if you like, to enquire. Being context-dependent returns us to ensuring that what we do has meaning and relevance to our work setting. Even right the way through to doctorate level, my first rule of thumb is to ask my own students, how does this relate to the work that you do with children and young people? And if it doesn't, then I have a big question mark about the extent to which that person will be able to engage, and to engage in an evidence-led way, but with passion. And I think that those two things can be really crucial components of a practitioner researcher. For example, had a nice piece from I think it was the University of Plymouth, where two practitioners and an academic worked around change management and the Senko role. It was really quite a powerful insight. And I know from looking at the Wiley, who published the journal, the statistics on downloads, that it captured quite a lot of attention from Senkos, because in many schools, Senkos are less integral to that process than they should be. And achievability. Achievability is also to do with being somewhat partisan about the methodology that one chooses. I happily regale anyone who wants to listen with the fact that I did not have the equivalent of what was then, when I was at secondary school, GCSE mathematics. I've never passed a mathematics exam in my life. And so I don't do metrics, I don't do statistics, I really struggle with numbers, you know. Typically, my wife looks after the entire financing of the household. I don't have a clue. You know, I might be sitting on a pot of gold, or I might be a bankrupt. I don't know. So I don't trouble myself with a deep engagement with statistics. I do with words, however, and with pictures. And I think that a methodological range is so crucial. Of course, mixed methodology is lionized as a classic contemporary approach in inquiry. And I think there's been some really successful practitioner work in that area. However, whether you're a statistician, whether you favour number or words or pictures or music or whatever, then choose your methodology which enables you to thrive as a researcher. One example of this from the journals was a recent piece by Sarah Wally, who looked at the role of three Senkos in a single local authority in northwest England. That appeared in the journal at the end of last year. Just three Senkos in conversation, really powerful words. And, you know, as an educational community, we know the value that we bring or obtain, rather, and bring, to the informal conversation, the staff room, the corridor, the social arena. And Sarah her methodology was precisely that. Recognition. It's okay to be more visible. I frequently talk in schools to people who've got the most marvellous, powerful, jumps out at you, ideas, interventions. And I say, you know, you should write about that, because I think it's valuable that the community hears about it. And the usual response, quite apart from the workload issues, which are, you know, pronounced, etc., who has got the time to sit and write when most of the time it's a creep into bed under a duvet and fast asleep because of exhaustion. However, the response is usually, oh, I couldn't do that. I'm not an academic, and use that word really quite pointedly. But I've had some of the most professionally enriching times talking with and helping to support new writers, people who do not conceptualize themselves as academic writers or even professional writers. But they have been able to capture something which really jumps off the page as an idea, as a practice, as an intervention, which others find helpful. So again, it has to be personal. A remarkable piece that I published a couple of years ago now, I think in 2016 or 17, was about design considerations and autism. A group of writers from the United States this time. Really so interested in this topic, and yet they said to me when they inquired about possible publication, surely practitioners, teachers, teaching assistants and others who access the journal could not be interested in a topic which was essentially about bricks and mortars, design and ergonomics and so forth. And I said, I think they could. I think they would. And sure enough, again, the data suggests a lot of downloads for an article of that kind. Context bound. The idea that we have to give recognition, we have to get stuff out there in order to address some of the challenges that Andre was talking about this morning. One piece that recently was published by Sarah Perlman and her colleague was about education and healthcare plans and the engagement with children and young people in those EHCPs. And being achievable. Again, we go back to material that's accessible and has meaning. What I sought to do from talking with my authors over a period of 3 or 4 years is talk about those materials that they found to be helpful. And I've got a database of maybe about 150, 160 sources that they used. And this is not simply tagged as a reference at the end of an article. This is something that they said, hey, as a practitioner, somebody relatively new to writing, this particular thing has helped me. And these are the top, most frequently mentioned pieces of material. Looking at the future and based upon the past, what I see is very much that we're at something of a crossroads now. I think that that initial publication of Support for Learning in 1985 was entitled Support. How do we provide support? When I took over as editor of Support for Learning in 2006, the very first issue was a themed issue, and it was subtitled Taking Possession of Practitioner Research. In other words, re-engaging and reformulating the position of practitioners within this exercise, not as an adjacent or bolt-on activity, but as integral to our teaching and professional development. And so the future, to me, suggests that there is a need to focus on a number of themes. And I'm saying this as an editor of a journal that receives, maybe about 7 or 8 articles every 2 or 3 weeks. I picked out the top 5. One is, I've already mentioned, the polemic, the ideas. Ideas are usually the seeding ground for research activity. Unless we have ideas about what could be, what could not be, then we won't take things forward. One idea that recently I've talked about with a teacher was as a result of an exclusion. And this teacher said, I'd be really interested to know the data about the point at which young people, children, were excluded from our schools and its interface with senior leaders in school. And she went on to explain that she felt that only when a young person had become a problem directly to a senior figure in the school was the exclusion process likely to be moved forward. It was an interesting, contentious topic, but unless you have the idea, then you can't dig further, formulate a hypothesis or a research question and attempt to explore it. So the polemic. Exclusions, another area where I think we're just on the fringes of. Off-rolling connected to that, of course, is pretty critical. If you could combine a polemical piece, an ideas piece, a think piece, and off-rolling, I think that would make a really powerful, almost journalistic read. But I would contend it has a place in our research literature. Co-production, I don't get very much at all directly addressing co-production in all its forms across the education landscape. I also don't get hardly anything which relates directly to school leaders, not to Senkos, but to school leaders. And this is, as Andre pointed out, this is where we need to look to if we're going to move the SEND agenda forward, school leaders being integral. But I have tried on several occasions where there has been a promising shoot to encourage someone to write, but there is a level of almost diffidence about writing about this topic, it seems. And finally, a huge area that I've seen a gradual depletion of in our journals, and in my journal particularly, over the last years. Writing about curriculum and intervention, not about assessment or identification or measurement or whatever, but writing about what really goes on in the heart and soul of our classrooms and our schools. Very, very few pieces. And in fact, I was up in Scotland earlier this week talking with somebody in the hope that this person would lead a themed issue for me on curriculum-related issues. That didn't used to be the case, actually. There used to crop up articles which addressed directly the nuts and bolts of working with children and young people from a subject-focused perspective. On the other hand, we have a surfeit of categorical articles about SEMH, articles about ASD, and ASD in particular. I mean, I could fill 4 or 5 issues with, and other journal editors actually say that as well. This is indicative, actually, of a skewing almost of interest based upon perhaps identification issues, public concern, professional imbalances in provision and so forth. But nevertheless, I think it's something that, as an editor of a generic SEN journal, I need to try to keep a hold of. Generic inclusion. I mean, surely we have moved past now the idea of yet another article talking about inclusion in my school. There has to. This is where we go back to the red of the traffic light, where we have to think about the theme. It has to be a really focused, sharp theme in order to capture the imagination of readers and indeed serve a useful purpose to practitioners and the research community. We've started to see over the last 3 or 4 years articles written by Senkos for Senkos, and that is now a rich and established publishing theme, and witness the posters surrounding us in this room. What I would say is going back to the original premise, and there you have, if you need any of this material, including the summaries of the articles that I've mentioned, which illustrate the themes, the methodologies, and the need to be visible, to be recognised, then you can get them from me. I'll gladly send them to you. But above all, you know, as a little bit of an advert for this this journal of ours, if you have ideas and you fancy having some, and I will use this not disrespectfully, I will use it advisedly, having some fun. You know, who says writing about the work that we do should not be fun, almost recreational, therapeutic? For some of my writers, that's very much what it is, being able to think through a particular issue. Please get in touch. You will receive a warm welcome, and you will receive support if you wish it. Research writing, as a practitioner, to go back to that phrase I used, has to be evidence-led. And by evidence, as I've implied, that can be the personal view. That is evidence. After all, qualitative research is traditionally made up of narratives from collectives of Senkos, teaching assistants, head teachers, or whatever, all saying, all contributing from interviews and so forth. What's the problem with just one person? So, evidence-led, but passion-driven. And that is where the thematic, the focus, the idea, what Terry Hayden calls the golden nugget of inquiry is actually found. Thank you very much.